I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Kyiv braces for more Russian strikes on infrastructure, we analyse the latest remarks on the invasion from Pope Francis and discuss the extraordinary story of the Zambian student who was killed on the front lines in Ukraine, fighting for Russia. I also speak to Orysia Lutsevych, head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House in London. We talk about NATO and the war, Russia's proxy use of NGOs, and contemporary Ukrainian politics.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 29th of November, day 279. And today, I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, our Russia correspondent Natalia Vasilyeva, and our senior foreign correspondent Roland Olifants. I started by asking Francis for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. A very dramatic morning across Ukraine as we speak. Air raid alerts have been issued across the whole of the country following reports from Ukrainian officials that Russia are preparing a new wave of missile and drone strikes. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko has urged residents to stockpile on food in anticipation of the worst-case scenario, talking about food, water, warm clothes and power banks being a priority. And this comes also off the back of President Zelensky yesterday saying that the upcoming week can be as hard as the previous one. Of course, we spoke at length last week about just quite how severe things were in many of the cities in Ukraine and in rural areas, and it would appear that they're expecting there to be a similar level of loss of water and a loss of electricity this week as well. Broadly speaking, Ukraine is still struggling to restore full power nearly a week after the wave of Russian missile strikes that damaged those crucial energy facilities across the country. The national power grid operator has said the electricity deficit has risen slightly from Monday following the emergency shutdowns at several of the key power plants scattered around the country. Indeed, there was a statement that's just gone out. I think it went out maybe about 15 minutes ago, saying that there's a current deficit of around 30%. Usually electricity producers provide 70% of the electricity consumption, but the deficit is 30%. So quite a severe situation this morning in terms of the energy front, which of course in many ways is an absolutely pivotal one at this moment. Just more broadly in the military sphere, and obviously Don will be covering this in more detail when he's back on, but just to give a lay of the land as things stand, it's been quite an interesting intervention this morning from the Ukrainian government, who have said that from their perspective at least 88,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since February's invasion. So a very striking figure there indeed, considerably higher than the estimates that we've seen up until now. Sometimes, as I said yesterday, international observers have cited about 30,000 killed for both sides. As I said yesterday, believe that those were low for the Russian numbers, and it would seem that the Ukrainian government, as I say, these figures cannot be verified. Of course, their numbers are likely to be higher, but nonetheless, this is considerably higher, are closer to perhaps what some other observers have said, which is that actually the figures are considerably higher in terms of the numbers killed. They've also said that as of November 29th, 280 aircraft, 261 helicopters and 2,911 tanks have been destroyed. So very considerable indeed. So that's the biggest sort of headline in the military space. There's also been some quite interesting insights offered this morning from the UK Ministry of Defence. They've talked about how the strategy of battalion tactical groups known as BTGs. This has sort of been a mainstay of the Russian army for a long time. It typically sort of comprises of a battalion or 2 to 4 companies reinforced with air defence, artillery, engineering, logistical support. That these are effectively been stopped being deployed now as a consequence of the way that the war is going. And for some people, that marks a very considerable decline in the capacity of the Russian army to operate effectively. They've been absolutely pivotal in victories in the past. And so if this is true, then I think it should be seen as quite a significant development. But I know that Roland has some thoughts on this.
Thanks, Francis. Well, let's go to Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent. Roland, what would you like to add?
I mean, on the BTGs, I don't have a terrific insight, but it strikes me as a sign that the BTG concept, as it has hit reality in the Ukraine war, has kind of failed, really. I mean, the idea of a BTG is to have this self-contained, as Francis said, battalion-sized unit which has everything it needs to do its own thing. So artillery, reconnaissance, support, logistics, all of that together in a kind of, up to 800-man unit. And it's a great idea, right, if you can make it work. But there have been problems with it from the get-go. I mean, one of the problems is that one of the successes Russia had with BTG deployment was in 2014, 2015, in the first invasion. And that ended with, frankly, a decisive Russian victory. But they had real trouble pulling it together. I mean, they sent in a tank unit from the Far East, from Buryatia, we think, into Donbass in that last winter stage of the war, around December, January, February, from 14 to 15. And, as we understand, they had to pull units together to make a BTG because it turned out they didn't have enough professionals available, just because of this long-running problem in the Russian military of paper soldiers, fake soldiers. You say you've got this many professionals, but actually most of your men are conscripts. You pocket the cash. The high command doesn't know you're up to strength. So that was an issue going into this war. And the other thing about BTGs, of course, is that they're, it kind of goes back to the idea of the core, which Napoleon came up with. This idea of a kind of autonomous, all singing, all dancing thing that can act like its own little army. Great for offensive warfare, but the offensives haven't been going too well. And when you've lost a lot of junior officers, a lot of NCOs, a lot of your experienced guys, and you're having to kind of knit things together in different ways to kind of keep things going, and you've got complicated tangles of chain of command between the regular military and your DNR, LNR levied militias from eastern Ukraine and Wagner. You find yourself having to basically improvise as it goes. So I think it's quite an interesting moment, probably in the evolution of Russian military thinking, coming up against the hard reality of going up against a peer enemy. And I'm sure when the war is over, there'll be lots of military thinking going at this, going, okay, why did the BTG system have to be abandoned? Was it because it was unsound? Was it because it wasn't done properly? Or was it because it's just not suitable for this war? But definitely an interesting development from the kind of war nerdish point of view.
Well, thank you, Roland and Francis. Francis, can I just come back to you quickly before we go to Natalia? Francis, you have one more military update for us.
Yes, I'll just be brief on this because we've been talking about this issue now for several weeks. This question of what weapons Ukraine need next and want next, and what the West is willing to provide. So we've heard an update this morning that the US could send, crucial word there, could, Ukraine some cheap new precision missiles that are capable of hitting targets 100 miles away, which of course would allow Kyiv to strike targets much deeper behind Russian lines than they currently are capable of doing so. The Pentagon is said to be considering a proposal by Boeing to send the ground-launched small diameter bomb, that's the GLSDB system, as the West struggles to meet Ukraine's demand for more arms. So These weapons are said to be relatively quick, cheap to produce, as I say, have about twice the range of standard HIMARS missiles. Of course, HIMARS have been absolutely critical in the Ukrainian settings up until now, and could be deployed in Ukraine as early as the next spring. This is according to a document, I should say, by Reuters. And whilst, of course, as we've been speaking about in the past, Washington has declined requests for the ATACMS missile, which has a range of 185 miles. These cheaper alternatives are still, as I say, quite considerable in terms of the distance that they're able to be fired, which is why for some people this will be a very, very significant intervention indeed. So, as I say, it's not guaranteed yet, but the fact that we're having these conversations now is suggestive that conversations are quite far developed.
Thank you very much, Roland and Francis, for that. And Natalia Vasilieva, our Russia correspondent, can I come to you? Pope Francis has made quite a few interventions in this conflict, in this invasion. They haven't always been well received. His latest seems incredibly controversial. You wrote this story with Nick Squires, our Rome correspondent. Can you talk us through what he said and what the reaction has been?
Good afternoon. Yes, that's right. The Pope has spoken on the Ukrainian conflict before, but it's important to say that in the past 9 months, he's been quite careful about not to blame the Kremlin directly. He has called on Russia to stop the hostilities, but he's been very careful not to criticize Vladimir Putin personally. And in an interview with an American Jesuit publication that came out last night, he was actually asked specifically why he has been unwilling to criticize the Russian president. And in response to that, he made quite a rambling reply saying that everyone is aware of the cruelty of Russian troops, but in his opinion, quote, the cruelest are perhaps those who are of Russia but are not of the Russian tradition, such as the Chechens, the Buryats, and so on. So those comments didn't play well with anyone in Russia, pretty much, whether they are pro-Kremlin or anti-Kremlin, because obviously they singled out just those two ethnic Russian minorities somehow for crimes committed in Ukraine. Now, we saw the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov being particularly active in the war in Ukraine. We saw reports of ethnic Buryats spotted in several towns outside Kyiv. Many local residents pointed out people of those particular ethnicities. But it's important to say that those reports came in the initial weeks of the war. And for many residents of Ukraine, those people simply looked too exotic, so they would stand out compared to thousands and thousands of ethnic Russian soldiers. And when the massacre of Bucha happened in April, there were reports of ethnic Buryats leading the massacre. Those reports were subsequently debunked. Ukrainian authorities recently published a major investigation along with independent Russian media outlets naming and identifying Russian soldiers who were involved in that atrocities. They were Russian soldiers of all ethnicities. There is no basis for anyone to say that that particular ethnicity is to blame or was the cruelest. And those comments were Russian authorities sounded quite offended by those comments, from of the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman to the Russian ambassador to the Vatican, who was never known for being too critical of the Holy See, and even for him that obviously was too much, and he issued a note of protest to express, quote, his indignation against the strange remarks attributed to Pope Francis. It's also important to say that there's quite a large anti-war community in Buryatia and outside of Buryatia, which is a Russian region in the east of Siberia, mostly populated by people of Mongol origin. And we've seen quite a large number of rallies abroad and different online protests by Free Buryatia Foundation. That's like a grassroots organization founded by ethnic Buryats who've been very vocal about their opposition to the war. Their leader, for example, this morning publicly called Pope Francis the racist and expressed her astonishment why, instead of putting a finger on one ethnicity, Pope Francis didn't blame Vladimir Putin directly or the Kremlin. We have yet to see what the Vatican says. There has not been any response from the Vatican to what appears to be a major political scandal in Russia and abroad.
Well, thank you very much for that, Natalia. That was very comprehensive and took us into, I think, why it was deemed so controversial, Pope Francis's remarks. Francis Durney, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
Well, yes, just a little bit of historical context on the significance of this debate. I mean, I think the Catholic Church will be very sensitive to this issue and charges of perhaps getting the Ukraine war wrong, if that's the way of articulating it. I mean, you might think the historians are a rather mild-mannered bunch, but one of the most hotly contested debates at the moment is known as the Pius Wars. And this is around the role of Pope Pius XII during the Second World War and his role in not doing enough, as some critics have said, or quite the opposite, of doing a lot with regard to the Holocaust and in denouncing the Nazis in their invasions of sovereign nations in Europe. In 1939, for example, Pope Pius XII expressed dismay at the invasion of Poland, but did not ascribe blame to anybody. So you can see why some historians have been particularly critical of that view. I mean, I think, as I say, this is a very, very contested area of historical scholarship, and there are some who are absolutely adamant that the Catholic Church should have done a lot more, who say that there was not enough outright condemnation of the actions of the Nazi state and of the Holocaust. There are those who point towards the rat lines, which were essentially a means for senior Nazi officials to be smuggled out of Nazi Germany before the end of the war. And Brazil and other countries. So there's that side of the view. And then the other side of the view is actually that much more was done than has been widely recognised, that there was a lot of private backstage conversations taking place between the Vatican and the Nazi state, and indeed lots of individual acts of heroism by senior priests within the Catholic Church to save Jews and other people who were persecuted by the Nazis. So, as I say, a very hotly contested area, this, which is why I mention it, and is a really ongoing historiographical debate of lots of interest. But I mention it here because I think it's important to frame this dispute about and reactions to how the Vatican are seeing on this within this broader struggle about the Vatican's role in the big issues of the last century. And indeed, this issue is one that I think people will have a lot of different perspectives on what the Vatican has done. It may be one where it won't be for many, many years until we know the true nature of the Church's role in trying to stop this war, or perhaps not doing enough.
Well, thank you very much for that, Natalia and Francis. Roland, can I come to you? One of our previous guests, Owen Matthews, has written a fascinating piece in the British magazine The Spectator, which you've read. I thought it'd be interesting if you give us a summary of what you think of what you found there.
Right. Yes, exactly. So Owen Matthews, who was on the podcast, I do not have the date in my mind, but I'm sure you do. But do look back through our archives and listen. It was a fascinating interview. Owen Matthews has a piece in The Spectator. I believe it might be an extract from or a summary of some stuff he reported in his new book that's out. But it's fascinating. He's basically looking at the relationship between Russia, China, and the United States, and the role of China in this war, which has been opaque, to say the least. So when the war began, everyone was wondering, is China going to back Russia, its ally, or not? There's obviously been a lot of diplomacy, tugging back and forth, the Russians saying to Beijing, come on, lend a hand, and the Americans saying to Beijing, oh, for God's sake, don't, this is a bad idea. And President Xi Jinping of China standing inscrutable in the middle. Well, Owen says he has a source with links to kind of high-ranking individuals in Beijing, who say this is the way it's played out. Essentially, China has played a kind of moderating role, a restraining role in a way, that has stopped the Russians, maybe stopped the Russians from going through with their nuclear threats, but there is a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo has been the Americans refrain from providing Ukraine with some of the more modern weapons that the Ukrainians have demanded. So, for example, Owen claims, citing his sources, that if you remember back at the beginning of the war, in the first week or so, Poland came up with this plan to send 26 to 33 MiG-29s to Ukraine. They said, look, if the Americans provide us with some modern fighter jets to backfill this, we'll send them over. It seemed like it was going to happen. Then at the last minute, the Pentagon or the White House suddenly said, oh, we don't think that's viable. And it was nixed. And no one really understood why. Now, Owen says this is because of a last minute initiative from Beijing, telling the Americans, don't do that. And quid pro quo, we'll kind of keep the Russians' more violent tendencies in check. And he points out that this followed Putin's first threat of nuclear escalation on the 27th of February, which genuinely alarmed the Chinese. Now, I would point out that this it seems to me fairly thinly sourced. It seems to be only one or maybe two sources on this, but it's not implausible at all. If we think back to the Bali summit, the G20 summit in Bali last week, where you had Joe Biden and Xi Jinping sitting down for 3 hours, remarkably long meeting, and then coming out with, really surprisingly on-message comments, kind of talking about the inadmissibility of nuclear war, a clear kind of warning to Russia that, look, both America and China, the world's two other preeminent nuclear powers, are not going to allow you to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That's a big gain for the Americans, but it will have come at a price. The Chinese are not just going to, hand out these diplomatic boons for free. And Russia is an important ally to China. I don't think we should underestimate that. And the Chinese are not just going to throw the Russians under the bus because they think Vladimir Putin has bitten off more than they can chew. So definitely something to think about. A few other interesting tidbits in here. Owen also claims that in the so-called No Limits Partnership, that's a treaty that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping came up with before the war, back in September last year, I think it was, which was a big document, mostly full of vague words without concrete commitments, talking about, having each other's back and we all have a future kind of multipolar world, and a kind of vague, woolly, strongly worded commitment to, a post-American world. And that common vision of ending the era of American interference and us being bossed around. But it was, if you read it carefully, kind of devoid of concrete. Well, Owen says that there was actually a secret protocol that was not published in that, which was a mutual defense pact, which would oblige them to come to one another's defense in case of attack. He says that the Chinese insisted on sticking in a clause adding some tricky, caveats to that commitment, which means the Chinese are off the hook for the Russians, annexing Kherson or whatever. The Chinese are not going to be obliged to go to war because Russia has said, right, Ukraine is Russia. So if true, canny. Now, I have to say again, single source, no one else has reported this. People I respect in Moscow point out that Russia is historically wary of signing this kind of treaty. So I would treat with a degree of caution, but I do think there is definitely something to look at here, because one of the long running questions is, why is the United States, why are the West holding back on certain weapon systems? Why haven't we given Ukraine, we, the collective West, NATO standard main battle tanks, Abrams or Leopards? The standard excuse is, oh, well, the supply chains, there's a big logistical supply chain in Abrams or Leopards. The Ukrainians know how to use T-72s, give them that instead. Well, really? Lots of other countries use these things. You could have put those supply chains in base. The ATACMS long-range missiles Francis was just talking about, clear refusal to provide them modern jet fighters. We haven't seen Ukraine provided with, a NATO standard fast jet. All these things have not been on the table. Why not? One of the theories was, well, Russian red lines. I really worried about Russian red lines. There's certainly something going on with China. So look, give it a read. I think it's interesting. And do listen back to our interview with Owen, where he describes this in his own words from a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you, Roland, very much for that summary. I think you're right to point out that we should treat this with quite a lot of caution. But as you said, interesting nonetheless, and it certainly speaks to some of the issues that we've been discussing for months now, and some of the issues that really lie at the heart of the collective West's response to the invasion of Ukraine. Just before we go on, Natalia and Francis, just wondered if you had anything to add or any thoughts, any nuance to add to that.
Well, I would just echo what Roland was saying there in terms of its significance and importance on so many different fronts that we've talked about now for some time. I mean, I recall when we started the podcast saying that absolutely that China's role in this was going to be integral, the kind of channels that would be open, back channels between the West and between Russia and China in terms of the scope and scale of this war. And if these revelations are true in The Spectator by Owen Matthews, then I think that it would speak to that. And no doubt many of the conversations that have taken place we will not be privy to for a very, very long time. And it may be one that historians will have to chew on when the archives become available and the memoirs are published. But as I say, it doesn't surprise me because that these conversations are taking place, because it would also explain the decrease in nuclear rhetoric that we saw after that particularly heated period. It would explain that, and it would also explain, to Roland's point, why certain weapons have not been delivered. So these kind of conversations happening behind closed doors are absolutely vital. And unfortunately, of course, from a journalist perspective, it's quite rare for us to get access to those until sometimes several months after the fact.
Well, thank you very much. Natalia Vasilyeva, I want to come to you next, and unless you have anything to add on that, please feel more than welcome to. But you've been looking at this extraordinary story of I believe a Zambian student in Russia who ended up on the front lines. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, sure. As our readers may have heard, a couple of months ago, just before Russia announced the partial mobilization, there was a drive to look for recruits for the Russian war effort in prison. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the notorious private military contractor Wagner, was actually seen himself trying to recruit convicts in Russian jail. And just earlier this month, we heard about the death of a man from Zambia. And the government of Zambia has been quite vocal about the issue. It has made several statements. It has publicly urged the Kremlin to explain how a Zambian national who was serving his sentence in a Russian prison ended up dead, and not just dead, but dead in eastern Ukraine. And just this morning, we heard from Mr. Prigozhin himself, the founder of the private military contractor Wagner, who confirmed that Zambian students identified as Lemihani Nathan Nirenda, aged 23, has indeed been killed in eastern Ukraine. And Mr. Prigozhin also claimed that he himself recruited Nirenda, and that happened sometime earlier this summer. And again, this is about taking Mr. Prigozhin's words for at a face value or not. But according to him, these Zambian students willingly volunteered to go and fight eastern Ukraine while he was serving a prison sentence in a Russian prison colony outside Moscow, allegedly because of colonial sentiment, and because he felt thankful to Russia for its efforts, historical efforts, recently and in recent decades, encouraging African nations to fight against colonialism. The Zambian student's case has been quite publicized in his native country, and we've seen Zambian media looking quite closely into that case. And what we know is that Lemihani Nirender was a student in Russia. Apparently, he was a very bright student back home. He enrolled in a university in Moscow to study nuclear engineering, quite a prestigious university, I have to say. And 2 years later, he was apparently working as a part-time delivery driver. And this was around the time when he was arrested by Moscow police, allegedly with drugs, and later on sentenced to 9 years in prison. Again, when I heard about this case, that sounded quite familiar, because we have Russian police is infamous for planting drugs on suspects. They are infamous for using drug possession as the most common, the most easiest to pin down crime if they wanted to improve their statistics. So it looks like this man simply fell victim to that scheme. And 2 years down the line, he was in a prison colony outside Moscow, which is where the Wagner mercenary group recruited him. We have heard from his family, who say that they had no knowledge of him ever wanting to go to fight. All we know that he called his family from prison saying that he was being released. They had no other details until they heard from a man in Russia earlier this month telling them that he died and that the parents should come to Russia and pick up his body.
Well, thank you very much for that, Natalia. In so many ways, what a really wretched story to have to report on. Roland and Francis, do you have any reaction to that? Anything to add before we move to Francis's final political updates?
I was just going to endorse what Natalia said about kind of very familiar, kind of sounding, given the reputation of Russian police for planting drugs on people, and also, the unfortunate fate of a lot of guys from Africa, guys and girls from Africa who go to study in Russia and quite often find themselves in quite tricky positions once they've gone to study. It's another issue. It's not really related to the war, and it's not something we've really got to a moment to get into now. But there is an issue with African students going to study in Russia and then finding themselves for various reasons very financially vulnerable positions, and getting trapped in low paying jobs and being open to abuses of that type. So just a footnote, and I just on that point, since we're talking about different nationalities and things like that, on the Pope's comments, it's the Pope's comments are frankly, they're quite mad, and they show, excuse me for editorializing, a kind of the exact opposite of an actual grasp of Russia's nature as a kind of multi-ethnic imperial, post-imperial state. He seems to have grasped the fact that there are different ethnic minorities within Russia, and he's provided a completely distorted, ridiculous kind of comment out of that, which is another thing we could look into. But I just read those comments this morning, and I thought someone has to say this. It's so out of touch with reality or an understanding of the nature of that country. It's kind of hopeless. Anyway.
Well, thank you, Roland. Thank you, Natalia. Francis, you have a few more updates for us, I believe, before we go to our final thoughts.
Yes, well, I'll try and whiz through as quickly as I can. So quite an insignificant story in the political realm this morning. NATO has committed to a future Ukraine membership. That's according to the Secretary General of the organisation, who has reaffirmed the military alliance's commitment to Ukraine, saying that the war-torn nation will one day become a member of the world's largest security organisation. He said, quote, "NATO's door is open. Russia does not have a veto on countries joining," he said in a reference to the recent entry of North Macedonia and Montenegro into the security alliance, and said that Russian President Vladimir Putin will get Finland and Sweden as NATO members soon. So, as I say, this is all coming on the back, of course, of what was meant to be a war that would divide the West, that would divide NATO, that would cause it all sorts of headaches. And actually the complete opposite has happened here. This has been a unifying force, and indeed, as he references there, Finland and Sweden are very much on the way to joining. It's more or less been signed off now, and this. In sense of Ukraine's future, I think they'll be absolutely cock-a-hoop at this morning, because whilst it may only be confirming what we already knew was the direction of travel, if Ukraine were to enter the NATO alliance at the end of this war, then I think that would offer them the security guarantees that they will desperately want after this invasion, because the risk for Ukraine is that whatever the end of this war looks like, that if there is a pause in hostilities, that at the first opportunity of strength, Russia will then do something else and will seek to resume operations. This is assuming that there were, as I say, some kind of ceasefire or something like that. So in that, for fear of that, they will be absolutely certain that whatever they agree to, the Ukrainians, they will have security guarantees. The security guarantees they were once promised, of course, by the West, but were not secured. And so this would offer that with NATO membership, because, of course, an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. So that's, I think, the lead political story. Just another couple that I wanted to touch on briefly. Coming off the back of this, ministers from Sweden, Norway, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia and Lithuania have all travelled to Kyiv today to further condemn Russia's invasion and to offer their symbolic and obviously political support to the country. They've met with President Zelensky in a pledge of ongoing support. There's been some quite striking remarks from them, just reiterating the line that the only way the war ends is with Putin's defeat. So obviously a symbolic moment when you see all of those significant ministers together in one go. I believe they took the train there, but I'm not certain. But either way, this train journey now seems to be very well utilised by politicians across Europe. I think Boris Johnson's used it. I think Ursula von der Leyen's used it. So and I think that it has its own chef as well on board. But anyway, that's by the by. And then just lastly on the state of US and Russia relations. There's been quite an interesting story this morning about how the communications line between the militaries of the United States and Russia has been used only once since the start of the war. This is from an official who spoke on the condition of anonymity, who said that the US initiated a call through the deconfliction line to communicate its concerns about Russian military operations near critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So that would suggest that it was not nuclear related, which is what one might expect, but rather had something to do with critical infrastructure. Unfortunately, we don't know any more than that. Those are the only details that we know. But nonetheless, quite interesting, I think, in two respects. As I say, the first is that I think if it's relating to critical infrastructure, it may be something to do with Zaporizhia, so that it's energy related, but it's not nuclear weapon related. But there are obviously concerns about the radiation risks attached to that. But as I say, I don't know that. I'm just saying that that's perhaps a possibility. I think the other interesting thing about this is that, of course, this line is still open and is still being utilised, which would, I think, speak to the fact that both sides, as we've spoken about probably about a month or so now, that we know that there are still extensive dialogues taking place between both armed forces for fear of obviously accidental escalation. So I think it's interesting in that respect, but I think it's also right to point out that there's been another story today that Russia has indefinitely postponed nuclear weapons talks with America that were scheduled for later this week. They were due to meet in Cairo tomorrow to discuss resuming inspections under a new reduction treaty, but Russia have pulled the plug on that, saying that, in essence, that the United States are operating in bad faith. The US State Department has said that unilaterally postponing the meeting and stating that it would propose new dates in due course. And as I say, I think this should be seen in the context of that whilst the dialogues are open on certain channels, signs of there being further cooperation, shall we say, with America at this moment is clearly seen as being too diplomatically sensitive, too diplomatically unwise, I'd say, from the Russian perspective, for all sorts of optics reasons. And so as a consequence, they've said that these meetings will not be going ahead. So a complicated picture there, but hopefully that covers the political sphere for today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Francis. Just one tiny little update from me. It's just come in on our live blog, and this speaks to, I think, Roland's summary of the Owen Matthews article in The Spectator on, the big question, why is the support of the West in terms of materiel in some sense limited? The Lithuanian foreign minister, this is Gabrielius Landsbergis, has said, NATO is not running, this is a quote, NATO is not running low on tanks, so therefore if we expand the inventory of what is being sent to Ukraine, then NATO has a chance to keep supply going, which is, I think, an interesting tidbit and speaks a little bit to what Roland was speaking about earlier. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, between us three. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts and your expertise. Can I just get your final thoughts, Roland, Francis and Natalia? I don't know who would like to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. What I would mention is something that you guys probably discussed yesterday. I'm not sure, I wasn't around. It's something that hasn't got enough publicity, in my opinion, but something to watch for. We heard from Ukrainian authorities yesterday saying that they are seeing signs that Russian troops could be withdrawing from the Zaporizhzhia energy plants. According to the head of the Ukrainian power grid, he said that Russians are even dismantling. He didn't say equipment, but he just put it the way he put it. He said Russians are stealing everything there is to steal. And Russian state media were quite quick to react and say that no such thing is happening, that Russia is staying at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant for good. But this is, if it happens, obviously this is going to be quite a dramatic turnaround for the Russian forces, and that's something I would watch out for this week and later on.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Francis Sternley.
Well, thanks, David. I just wanted to point out a story that I saw actually in the Kyiv Independent last week, and I've been meaning to talk about it for a while because I think it speaks to another aspect of this war that can often get lost amid all of the talk of military affairs and political stuff. So the Kherson Fine Arts Museum once hosted one of the richest collections in all of Ukraine, but it's been emptied of all of its works by Russian officials. That's according to their story. Now, that's 14,000 works were in its collections, and apparently it's been stripped bare, and the piece goes into a lot of detail about what exactly was there, but obviously speaks to the manner in which looting has been part and parcel of those territories that Russia has controlled since the war began, not just of art, but of all sorts of individual property as well. And I think just sort of to offering some contextualization to this, of course, the looting of art for economic benefit, as well as a way of illustrating cultural dominance and as well as the economic benefits, is also a way of seeking to erase a culture. And it's as old as war itself. The Romans would show off their looted conquests in triumphs through the streets of Rome. Napoleon, of course, famously stole the horses from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice and placed them atop the Arc de Triomphe to show his conquest of Europe. In modern times, both the Nazis and the Soviets perhaps offer the most egregious examples of art that's been looted, although I would say with one key difference. Whilst we hear the odd story of Nazi loot being discovered and returned to its owners, most of the major lost masterpieces from the Second World War, many of which I think went to decorate Hermann Goering's castle, but anyway, were restored to the museums that they were looted from. But that's not the case with much of the art that was stolen by the Soviets in the Second World War. It's still believed that there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lost masterpieces from Europe hidden in the depositories of the Hermitage. They're in a sort of state of perpetual limbo because they were declared that they would almost certainly, if they were discovered, if they were declared, they would be almost certainly restituted at considerable expense and amidst considerable international outrage that they've been holding on to them for so long and have not made them public. And so on the back of that, I remember visiting Museum Island in Berlin a few years ago, and there's still a museum there that offers catalogues of lost art with black and white photographs of what has vanished, and they're printed interestingly in German but also in Russian. So the idea being that if anyone knows where these artworks have gone in Russia, that they might take this catalogue and go and have a look. So as I say, I mention this just because hopefully these stolen artworks will be returned at the end of the war, that the international eye will remain on them. But the risk is that that will not be the case, and that these artworks will be lost potentially not just for a generation, but for a very, very long time indeed. And so it's really important, I think, that the international community, whilst paying, of course, as much close attention as it has to war crimes, that it also pays as much attention to cultural crimes too.
Thank you very much, Francis and Natalia. Natalia, we do have a question from listeners, but unfortunately I think we've run out of time today, so I promise we will get to it next time you're on. Roland Oliphant, would you like the very final words?
Sure. I mean, I think, look, this morning there's been obviously this big air raid alert in Ukraine, then cancelled, but it looks like something is coming. Zelensky was very clear on Sunday night, we're expecting something nasty. There's been a lot of Twitter chat. Ukrainian intelligence has been talking about the Russians, loading up their strategic bombers ready for a strike. It's very likely today, tomorrow, this week, we're going to see another one of these absolutely devastating, horrible, 100-odd cruise missiles slamming into Ukrainian energy infrastructure across the country. Possibly they're waiting for the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Bucharest to wrap up. Show of strength that would be very in character for Vladimir Putin, snubbing his nose at the talking shops of the West. That talking shop, by the way, is again important, and it speaks to what Owen Matthews was talking about in his article. That what are the limits on NATO provision, Western provision and support of arms to Kyiv. So both very important things to keep an eye on. I've had a moment to think about those rambling thoughts I was expressing about what the Pope said about atrocities being committed not by Russians themselves but by ethnic minorities within Russia. This is one of the rare moments where I think I can say I'm on the same page as the Russian Foreign Ministry being outraged by this. I mean, I think the fact is Russia's nature is of a kind of multi-ethnic empire dominated by Russians, but many, many different peoples in there. There is a fascinating discussion to have about the nature of Russia in that sense, and what it means for a post-war Russia, and whether Russia could break apart. Things like this, it's something that people discuss when they're talking about what will Russia look like after this war. Could we see it? Could we see it broken up? Or not? Does it inform why Russia is seeking to reconstitute its empire in Ukraine? It's a very, very interesting discussion. I'm afraid Pope Francis has approached it in completely the wrong way. But maybe we can at some point talk about that, because it is a fascinating, deep, multifaceted issue, which I think it is worth our listeners and the world in general being aware of and being able to grasp. But saying that only Russia's ethnic minorities commit war crimes is it speaks for itself.
Last week I spoke to Orysia Lutsevych. Orysia is the head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House in London. We spoke about NATO and the war, Russia's proxy use of non-governmental organisations, and her thoughts on contemporary Ukrainian politics. Here is our conversation.
So I myself am Ukrainian. I'm from western part of Ukraine, and I've been with Chatham House for now more than 10 years, doing research on the forces that are shaping change in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Belarus. And since the full-fledged invasion, in a way, I think many people's lives changed. It was an intensity of research, of media work, but most important, explaining what is happening in Ukraine. And this is something we do on top of our regular program called Ukraine Forum that I've started 8 years ago. And I was already tired before Putin invaded Ukraine. Suddenly, I realized that I haven't really realized little the pressure that is here to come in the coming months.
You wrote, "The longer this war lasts, the higher the chances it will spill over into NATO territory." I think you wrote that before the incident in Poland last week. So I wondered if you'd like to just explain what you meant and talk a little bit about the incident in Poland and what it means for NATO and the war in Ukraine.
Well, the quote you're referring to is in my op-ed for The Guardian, and actually I have updated it. I was working on the Ukrainian takeover of Kherson, and before it was released, we have seen this incident in Poland that killed 2 people right 20 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And of course, it was a very intense moment where you could see in Ukrainian security community media, there was almost like people took away the breath thinking, what does that mean for the war? And if the war spills over, is it going to take away the attention of Western allies from supporting Ukraine, or actually it will mobilize more assistance for Ukraine? Of course, what I mean, the longer this war lasts, is that it is in extreme intensity military conflict that we have not seen on the European continent since the Second World War. Modern wars previously were either quite speedy, fast, almost like these thunderbolts, or they were in some faraway territories in Afghanistan, Iraq, that lasted longer, but had a very limited military engagement of Western armed forces. Well, here we are seeing a pounding of Ukraine by ballistic missiles by Putin. I think today there are more than 4,000 missiles that have been launched on Ukrainian cities, and it's mostly these missiles are used against the civilian infrastructure. What happened on the border with Poland is that Russians were trying to target one of the thermal power stations that is very close to the Polish border. And of course, the miscalculations, from what we understand now, by Ukrainian air defense caused this incident and tragic loss of life. But you see what I mean, is because Putin is losing his war in the east, he is not able to take any new Ukrainian territory. He decides to break the spine of Ukrainian resistance, but making Ukrainian cities difficult to live in. So also it means that he is targeting areas close to NATO borders. Supply routes could be targeted that are delivering Western military assistance to Ukraine. And we may also see some sabotage actions inside NATO territory to, for example, disrupt military supply flows. So all of these options are on the table, and we should be very aware of the possibility of risks. And I'm sure NATO is preparing for all eventualities.
So just on that, you think that the more Putin loses, the more risks he'll be willing to take, and that's kind of what we're talking about?
Absolutely, he is becoming more desperate, more reckless, because he was bragging that he'll be able to take Kyiv, in 2-3 weeks, and now we are almost 9 months in the war, and he actually has lost 50% of the territory that he has reclaimed since the start of the invasion. He is losing strategic power all over. His military goals are not being achieved, and he is resorting to these barbaric tactics of basically breaking the spine of Ukrainian nation.
Let's move on from that. Thank you so much for that answer. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. You've written about this completely different issue, Russia's use of proxy NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to achieve its foreign policy objectives. This is an area we really haven't looked at. So I was wondering if you could just give us your lowdown on what you mean by that, where they work and whether they're successful or not.
Well, you see, this is a very interesting area where something that in the big scope of things, the West has underestimated the nature of Putin's regime that led to this horrific war. And I think there were warning signs of what Putin is up to since his kind of second coming to power in 2000s, when he basically wanted to consolidate power. He consolidated the power, but then he felt quite emboldened that he can, coerce countries in the former Soviet Union, in his Russia's near abroad, as they called it, in order to maintain Russian grip. So, to be honest, Putin was also quite paranoid about the color revolutions that took place in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, and he was sure that these were kind of doctored by the US government to undermine his friendly puppet pro-Russian regimes. So he thought he would mimic some of that American tactics to create a set of his own agents of influence that would be under the cover of non-government organizations and penetrate various fora such as OSCE, Council of Europe, UN, to basically present these groups as independent, but they were mouthpieces of the Kremlin, they were funded by the state, they were not independent groups, they were basically under the orders of the Kremlin to spread this worldview, for example, about the violation of rights of Russian ethnic minority in the region, in the Baltic states, in Ukraine. But what is interesting now, as we see it, for example, the role of Orthodox and religious communities, how Kremlin, in a way, Putin fused the power of Orthodoxy and the state, and he uses church, Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, also to foment discontent, to split the nation. And we've seen reports on Ukrainian security services searching Russian main cathedral of the Orthodox Church, Kyiv, Pechersk, Lavra, and finding some of the Russian citizens who were harbored there. They could have been under suspicion for sabotage, lots of cash, lots of propaganda material about this puppet project of Novorossiya. So you see that they try to use all tools in order to advance their foreign policy objectives. And many of those groups actually became under the sanctions on Ukraine, and they were put by Ukrainian government on a sanction list after the annexation of Crimea and the war that they started in 2014 in the Donbass.
Do you think that these groups had more success in the West and in the international sphere, just partly because the West didn't know it as the Baltic states, or as Ukraine would have known it? As you said, Ukraine is looking quite hard at these places, and we know we've had the monastery raids yesterday. It's something we'll look at later today. But I was just wondering if you think that in some parts of the world, they were quite successful, but they potentially found it quite difficult in the, as you said, the near abroad. I don't know. Would you agree with that? Is that fair?
Well, not necessarily. I think until the 2014, they also had quite a free hand in Ukraine, because nobody, to be honest, saw them as a real threat. Yeah, there were some activists or journalists doing investigations, but the state as such was weak enough to actually go after them and really investigate what it is they were doing. For example, in Crimea, before the annexation in 2013, Russian international aid, Россотрудничество, was not, doing cultural projects or humanitarian assistance. They were actually brainwashing the local population and journalists about Nazi regime in Kyiv, the possible genocidal extermination of the Russian ethnic inhabitants of Crimea. So they wanted to prepare the ground for eventual annexation. This is what they were doing. In the West, they are more benign, you could argue, but they do penetrate universities, and what they do is they also kind of spread this ideology, the Russian worldview, for example, about the role of Russia in the Second World War, or about the region, or about, for example, the history of Crimea, that it has always been Russian. So they, in a way, confirm Russian propaganda and do not work as independent cultural institutions. And we should be just aware of it and decide whether we want to give them a free hand or we think that they are too dangerous for our democracy.
Last week, we spoke to academic Olga Onich on Ukrainian democracy and the Ukrainian political economy, this political sphere, and she gave us a wonderful sort of rundown of Ukrainian development and change since independence. I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about that. Looking at looking at Zelensky and his challenges, what would you say are the sort of pressing issues in the domestic sphere for him? And maybe it'd be interesting to look at this sort of just before the war and the full-scale invasion, and now. That's kind of my question.
I mean, it's an interesting question because you could see how the nation changes the way it behaves under assault as compared to normal politics of a peacetime. Zelensky, before the war, was actually losing a grip on his popularity. He was supported and trusted by roughly 35% of Ukrainians. He seemed like he could not deliver peace, he could not deliver anti-corruption agenda, he was struggling. And then when Russians attacked, everything turned upside down. He was quite successful in channeling the Ukrainian resistance into his speeches. He was brave to remain in Kyiv, and you could see today almost 90% of Ukrainians approve of his policy, and almost 70% trust him. This is unheard of level of trust within Ukraine to the office of the president. Ukrainians, let's remember, always a bit suspicious, mistrustful of authority because of the culture of a colonial domination by Russia, by Poland, by Turkey. So Ukrainians are very careful in giving their trust to an individual taking a high office. But there's a clear consolidation of the nation. But what is interesting that democracy, even under the martial law, remains quite vibrant. You have people debating questions of the future security architecture for Ukraine, whether it's and how this could be arranged. You have issues about reconstruction of Ukraine, and this is quite impressive under the bombshells and where you have almost 50% of Ukrainian energy grid destroyed with no electricity. Ukrainians are brainstorming the outlook of a future modern Ukraine. You have issues such as press freedom and media freedom being discussed, because there was a lot of consolidation on the media sector with the United National Marathon, and some TV channels were excluded, mostly affiliated with former President Poroshenko. Many people didn't like it. They thought it was censorship, that it was not a fair media policy, and they are trying to push for change in that. And also, Ukraine has been granted EU candidate status. This is very significant because EU has put certain conditions that Ukraine has to meet before the accession negotiations can open. And these issues are quite complex. It's about rule of law, it's about reforming justice, it's about media reform. So you see, even under the war, under so much stress and strain, Ukrainians are delivering reform, and out of 10 of these different steps, independent experts say Ukraine has completed almost 50% of that and is prepared to deliver more. And finally, economy. I mean, economy is something that Zelensky has to deal. 5 million Ukrainians lost jobs. 40% of Ukraine's economy has been destroyed. People are on the go, on the move. Companies are struggling to maintain people because some are mobilized. Women with children are fleeing to safety. So they're trying to install some kind of support, perhaps similar to COVID times here, if you think about some kind of subsistence lines to companies to preserve their workforce, to be able to function, to pay taxes back to the state, and just to keep Ukraine afloat. So you see, his hands are full in addition to fighting Putin.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that. I just want to ask, we are months and months and months, since February, the world's media has been looking at Ukraine, and we've had people on TVs and podcasts writing books about what's happening, trying to understand it, trying to interpret it. And I wonder, from your perspective, what do you think specifically Western analysts sort of still get wrong about Ukraine, about Russia, Ukraine, and this war?
There are a couple of issues that I noticed, and I think it was not just before this invasion, but overall, I would say, since the collapse of Soviet Union, since some of these countries like Ukraine and others started to assert themselves more as westward looking, trying to reform, I think we have underestimated the actual desire of these countries to pay a price to belong to the transatlantic community. And Ukraine was always kind of perceived as a corrupt, weak state, never able to, kind of muddling through, never using its potential. And I think this war actually showed the strengths of Ukraine on the battlefield because Ukraine has reformed enough, for example, in its armed forces, decentralizing governance, having vibrant civil society. And the opposite to that is, I think, the misunderstanding of the nature of Putin's regime. So you could hear in the West as the war started again, perhaps it was NATO to blame, because perhaps US was too assertive in the region, perhaps there was a room to negotiate with Russia. And I honestly think Russia has been captured by a very conservative security forces group of people that is really on this revanchist neo-colonial conquest because they consolidated power at home. And we thought, oh, perhaps this only will apply to the neighborhood of Russia. But now we see how this threatens the whole world order and reverberates, from food crisis to energy crisis. And finally, on the battlefield, I think we were too much focused on the number of tanks and men at arms that Russia and Ukraine can command, while not understanding the importance of morale, the importance of smart strategy, the capacity of countries like Ukraine to learn on the go, because it's a free society, and free societies learn so much better than autocracies. And this total mobilization of Ukrainian society that is a big floating cushion carrying Ukraine through this horrendous armed conflict with a lot of confidence and a lot of desire and preparedness to take suffering for the future that many Ukrainians are confident will be bright.
Orysia, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
Well, I think it's important to understand that this war was also caused by a divergence of political cultures of Ukraine and Russia. And Putin understands that, and he thought it's the last chance for him to keep hold on Ukraine. And that difference is fundamental and often misunderstood in the West, that Ukraine is a pluralistic society, that Ukraine rejects autocracy and had these regular, almost 10 years uprisings, from Orange Revolution to Revolution of Dignity, to assert human rights and to assert justice. So shouldn't be surprising that now Ukrainians are ready to die and defend all these values, because they have been doing it all along. And finally, Ukraine is fighting like team of teams. This is something the modern armies are learning when they have to be effective, mobile, agile, and that is possible because very strong sense of community and ownership of that future that is, of course, based on the prosperity and respect for an individual.
And just my last question, potentially leaving the war to one side, we interviewed a Ukrainian novelist yesterday who gave an interesting answer, who said, she'd really love, it's obviously good in some ways that the media are paying attention to this and doing so much, but she wished that, Ukraine would be known after the war for different things, for things that are not to do with bloodshed and violence and the military. I was wondering what you thought about that. What would you wish that more people knew about Ukraine and Ukrainian society and culture?
I actually would like to echo what the novelist said, because I think Ukraine is a bit of a black hole for culture in Europe, something that is unexplored, while at the same time, since 2014, there is a real renaissance of Ukrainian culture because it's being threatened by Putin. And as our identity and culture is being threatened, a lot of writers, musicians, artists are expressing very interesting cultural manifestation. So there are books, there's music, and I think discovering Ukraine through culture is something that I also agree would open a very unexpected treasure for many readers and listeners, because there is an interesting cultural product.
Just to get them started, what would you recommend they look at first in terms of books and music, maybe?
Well, I personally very much like Daha Braha, which is an interesting mix of ethno tradition and I would say almost electronic music, ethno-fusion. And also for literature, there's Serhiy Zhadan, who was rumored to possibly get a Nobel Literature Prize this year, but he just didn't make it the cut. But Serhiy Zhadan, he's a poet, he's a novelist, he is from Luhansk originally in the East. And he really, through his work, expresses that identity of the borderland, of the frontier, of mining cities, of changes that happened there since the 90s that shaped who Ukrainians in the East are.
Orysia, thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app, and check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Emily Hill.